The conference table felt like a courtroom. My younger brother sat across from me with a lawyer I'd never seen before. A yellow legal pad in front of him, a look on his face like he'd already won. 41 years. That's how long I spent building my auto repair business from a single-bay garage in Akron, Ohio, into a full-service shop with 12 employees and a customer list that stretched back to when gas cost $1 a gallon. And now, at 63 years old, I was sitting in a mediator's office being told I owed my brother half of it. Let me back up. My name is Alan. I'm the oldest of two boys. My brother's name is Kevin. We grew up in the same house, same neighborhood, same everything, but we became very different people. I dropped out of college after one semester. Not because I couldn't do the work. I just knew in my bones that the classroom wasn't where my life was going to happen. I'd been tinkering with engines since I was 11. My father had an old Ford pickup that he never fully fixed, and I used to spend Saturday mornings underneath it just trying to figure out how it worked. By the time I was 16, I was doing brake jobs for neighbors out of the driveway. Kevin went a different route. He was the one who got the grades, the one my mother lit up about at the dinner table. He went to Ohio State, then got a master's degree in public administration, then spent the next 3 decades working for the county government in a management position. Stable job, pension, the whole thing. We weren't close exactly, but we weren't enemies either. Thanksgiving, Christmas, the occasional birthday call. That was our relationship. My father's name was George. He was a machinist for most of his working life. A quiet man who didn't say much but meant everything he said. In 1983, when I was 22 and had been renting a tiny garage space on the east side of Akron for about 8 months, he called me over to the house. I remember it was a Sunday. My mother made pot roast. After dinner, he and I sat at the kitchen table and he slid an envelope across to me. Inside was a check for $9,000. I stared at it for a long time. That was a lot of money in 1983. A lot of money for a machinist who'd worked his whole life without much margin. He said, "This is to get you on your feet, not a loan. A gift. I want you to have a real shot." I tried to give it back. He wouldn't take it. He said the only thing he asked was that I make something of it. I told him I would. I used that $9,000 to put a down payment on a proper lease, buy a used lift, and get my business license in the state of Ohio. I named it Hartley Auto Service, after our family name. I was the sole owner, the sole operator, the sole operator, the sole everything for the first 3 years. I worked 7 days a week. I slept in the office more than once. I missed holidays, I missed weekends, I missed my own 35th birthday because a fleet account needed an emergency repair, and I was the only one who could do it. My father never showed up and demanded to be listed as a co-owner. He never asked me to sign anything over to Kevin. He came by once in a while, drank coffee from my little machine in the waiting area, and told me he was proud of me. That was all he ever wanted. Kevin, meanwhile, was building his life in Columbus. He bought a house in a suburb there, got married, had 2 kids. We saw each other at holidays. He never once came to the shop, never asked how it was going in any serious way, never offered to help, never offered to invest, never expressed any interest in the business beyond polite conversation at Thanksgiving. I have nothing against that. His life was his life. I wasn't resentful, I was just building mine. In 2018, my father had his first serious episode. The doctors called it early-stage vascular dementia. It progressed slowly at first, then faster. My mother had passed in 2014, so it was just the 2 of us managing his care. Kevin helped when he could. I'll give him that, but the day-to-day fell mostly to me because I was closer. I had him over for Sunday dinners. I drove him to appointments. When it got to the point where he couldn't live alone anymore, I was the one who found him a good memory care facility in the area and made sure he was comfortable there. During that period, he would have good days and bad days. On the good days, he was almost himself. On the bad days, he didn't recognize me. It was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through, watching that slow erasure. My brother came to visit a few times a year. That was fine. I wasn't keeping score. My father passed away in March of 2021. He was 81 years old. The funeral was small the way he would have wanted. Kevin and I stood at the graveside, and that was one of the few times as adults I felt genuinely close to him. Grief does that sometimes. It pulls people together for a moment. The will was simple. He didn't have much left. The family home had been sold years earlier to help pay for care. What remained was divided equally between Kevin and me. A modest amount, a few personal items, nothing complicated. We shook hands outside the attorney's office and went back to our separate lives. That's what I thought anyway. 8 months later, Kevin called me. He asked if we could have lunch. I said sure. I thought maybe he wanted to talk about something with the estate, maybe a loose end I hadn't thought about. We met at a diner near my shop. He told me that before our father's decline, our father had told him that Hartley Auto Service was a family business, that it had been started with family money, that Kevin was entitled to half. I put down my coffee cup. I asked him to say that again. He said it again. He said our father had told him, at some point in the years before the dementia took hold, that the business was meant to be shared between the two of us, that the $9,000 wasn't just a gift, it was an investment, and Kevin was owed a return on it in the form of ownership. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, very calmly, that our father had no ownership stake in the business. Never had. The check he gave me in 1983 was a personal gift, not a business investment. He was never listed on the business license, never paid taxes as a co-owner, never received a single dollar from the business in 41 years. And whatever he may or may not have said to Kevin, privately, verbally, with no documentation, didn't change any of that. Kevin said he understood that was my position. He said he had spoken to an attorney. I drove back to the shop and sat in my office for about an hour just looking at the wall. The mediation was scheduled for a January morning, which in Akron means gray sky and cold that gets into your knees. Kevin arrived with his attorney, a younger man in a good coat. I had my own attorney, a woman I'd worked with for years on business matters, someone I trusted completely. The mediator was a retired judge named Philip. He had that quality some retired judges have of seeming very patient on the surface, while being mildly impatient underneath. He asked each side to present the nature of the dispute. Kevin's attorney went first. He laid out the argument. The business had been seeded with family money. The founder's father had expressed clear intent that the business was to be considered a family asset, and Kevin had a reasonable claim to equitable ownership, given that the original capital came from a shared family source. I listened to all of it. It was well constructed, I'll say that. It sounded plausible if you didn't know the actual facts. Then the mediator looked at me and said, in a tone I didn't love, "It sounds like your father had a different understanding of this arrangement than you did. Sometimes families have these kinds of gaps in communication. Would you be open to discussing what a fair resolution might look like?" He had already decided. I could see it. He'd heard Kevin's attorney lay out a smooth narrative, and he'd made a quiet assumption before I'd said a word. I was the older brother who'd struck it rich, while the younger one got nothing. I was the one who needed to be generous. My attorney put her hand on the table and said, "Before we discuss resolution, we'd like to present some documentation." Kevin's attorney looked up. Kevin looked at me. I reached into the folder I'd brought and I placed it on the table. A photocopy of the original check. $9,000, dated November 6, 1983, made out to me personally, not to a business, not to a joint account. Personal. The memo line, in my father's handwriting, said, "For Alan, get yourself started." Next to it I placed a copy of the original business license, filed with the state of Ohio in February of 1984. Sole proprietor, Alan Hartley. No other names, no partners, no co-owners. Then I placed the tax filings from 1984, 1985, and 1986. 3 consecutive years in which the business operated at a loss. 3 years I had absorbed entirely on my own, with no contribution from my father, and certainly none from Kevin. Then I placed one more document. A letter my father had written to me in 1991, when the business had its first genuinely profitable year. I had kept it in a fireproof safe for 30 years. In the letter, my father congratulated me on what I'd built. He wrote, and I'm not going to reproduce it word for word, but the meaning was unmistakable, that he was glad the gift had helped me get started, and that he knew the success was entirely because of my hard work. He said the business was mine, that I had earned it, and that he was proud to have played a small role at the very beginning. He signed it, your dad. The room was quiet for a moment. Kevin's attorney asked to see the letter. I let him read it. I watched his face as he read it. He set it down on the table and looked at his legal pad. He didn't write anything. The mediator looked at Kevin. Kevin was staring at the check, at his father's handwriting. For Alan, get yourself started. Kevin's attorney said quietly that he'd like to take a brief recess to confer with his client. We stepped into the hallway. My attorney looked at me and said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. When we went back in, Kevin's attorney said that his client had reconsidered the nature of the claim, that given the documentation, there was no viable legal basis for pursuing shared ownership. He used careful, neutral language, the kind that attorneys use when they're trying to close a door without making noise. Kevin didn't look at me. Philip, the mediator, said that in light of the documentation, he saw no grounds for mediation and that both parties were free to leave. We walked out into the parking lot. Kevin and I ended up standing near our cars without having planned it. His attorney was already on his phone a few feet away. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't angry exactly, I was tired. 41 years of tired. Kevin spoke first. He said he honestly believed it. He said that our father had told him a few years before the dementia diagnosis that the business had been started with family money and that he'd always hoped we'd run it together someday. I looked at him for a long time. I told him that I believed he believed it. I don't think Kevin was lying. I think our father, in his later years, maybe already in early cognitive decline before anyone recognized it, maybe just being sentimental in the way old men sometimes are, had said something that Kevin heard one way and held on to. I think our father loved both of us and wanted us to be close, and maybe he thought he was expressing that love. Maybe he said, I always hoped it could be a family business. And Kevin heard, it is a family business and you own half of it. I don't know. I'll never know. What I told Kevin, standing in that cold parking lot in January, was this. Our father gave me $9,000. That was not nothing. It mattered. I want to be clear about something, though. I didn't go to college. I walked away from that path to build the shop. Kevin went to Ohio State, and our father and mother paid for that. 4 years of tuition, room and board, books. In 1983 dollars, that was probably $35,000 or $40,000. Not a loan, not a gift with strings. An investment in Kevin's future, just like the $9,000 was an investment in mine. Kevin was quiet. I told him that our father was fair. He gave us both a foundation. What we built on that foundation was our own. I told him I wasn't interested in being enemies with him. He was my brother, and I wanted us to find our way back to something. But I also needed him to understand, clearly and permanently, that Hartley Auto Service was built by my hands over 4 decades, and it was mine. He nodded. He got in his car. He drove away. That was 14 months ago. We've spoken twice since then. Once when his youngest graduated high school and I called to say congratulations. Once when I had a minor health scare and he called to check in. Both conversations were short, a little careful, a little like 2 people testing ice to see if it holds, but it held both times. I've thought about that morning a lot. Not with bitterness mostly, more with a kind of clarity I didn't expect. You go through 41 years of building something, and you stop thinking about why you kept all those documents. You stop remembering why you filed the original check in a manila folder in a fireproof safe. You do it because you're careful, because you're organized, because that's just how you run a business. You don't do it because you're preparing for the day your brother brings a lawyer to a conference room and tells you your father's gift was actually a partnership agreement. But the documents were there. They were always there. My shop manager, a guy named Billy who's been with me for 16 years, asked me once how the family situation had resolved. I told him briefly. He nodded and said, "Good thing you kept your paperwork." That's it. That's the whole lesson, really. Not about revenge, not about winning. About the fact that when you build something real, over real time, with real work, there is a paper trail. There are receipts. There are tax filings and licenses and letters and people's handwriting that say exactly what was given and what was built and who built it. My father knew that. He was a machinist. He understood that things that are made have records. He kept the receipt from every repair he ever made to his own equipment. That was just how he lived. I inherited that from him. The business turned 62 employees strong this past spring. We handle fleet contracts for 3 local school districts and a regional delivery company. I'm thinking about retirement in the next few years, though I'll probably never fully leave. There's a young mechanic on my team, 24 years old, reminds me a little of myself at that age, and I've been thinking seriously about some kind of succession arrangement. Something written, something clear, something that no one could ever sit across a conference table and misunderstand. I learned that documentation matters more than trust. Not instead of trust. More than it, because trust is what you have between people when everything is fine. Documentation is what tells the truth when memory starts to fail, when grief distorts things, when someone hears what they want to hear instead of what was actually said. I don't blame my brother. I don't even blame my father. I keep that letter in the safe still. I take it out sometimes. His handwriting was neat, careful, like everything about him. Your dad. That's all it says at the bottom. Just that. And it's enough. I still think about that check sometimes. A piece of paper my father wrote out at a kitchen table in 1983, with a memo line in his careful handwriting for Alan, "Get yourself started." He didn't know when he wrote it that it would sit in a fireproof safe for 40 years and eventually end an argument that should never have started. He just knew what he was giving and why. That kind of clarity, knowing exactly what you're doing and meaning it, that's something I've come to believe is rarer than most people think. What happened between Kevin and me wasn't really about money, if I'm being honest. It was about what happens when people don't do the hard work of being clear with each other. My father loved both of us. I genuinely believe that. But somewhere along the way, in his later years, he said something to Kevin that he never said to me, or never said on paper. And Kevin held on to it the way people hold on to things they want to be true. I don't think my brother is a bad person. I think he made a choice that a person without a strong moral center makes. He let his need override his honesty. He knew somewhere underneath the legal argument that he hadn't built anything. He knew that, and he moved forward anyway. That's the thing about integrity. It's not about the big, dramatic moments. It's about the smaller choice, the quieter one. The moment you decide whether to pursue something you haven't earned. Kevin made one choice. I made another 41 years earlier, when I decided to build something instead of waiting for something to be handed to me. Those two choices led, in a straight line, to that conference room in January. I've also thought a lot about what it took to even be in a position to defend myself. Not just having the documents, but knowing enough to keep them. Understanding from the beginning that a business is a legal entity and that relationships don't protect you when things go sideways. That took a kind of thinking I had to develop on my own, without much guidance. No one sat me down and explained how to structure a sole proprietorship or why a paper trail matters. I figured it out because I paid attention, because I asked questions, because I never assumed that good faith was the same as a signed document. That kind of disciplined thinking, building knowledge deliberately over time, is what stood between me and losing something I'd spent 4 decades creating. And then there's just the plain stubbornness of it. 41 years of showing up. The Saturdays I didn't take off. The 3 years the business lost money, and I kept going anyway. Billy, my shop manager, said it simply, "Good thing you kept your paperwork." But the paperwork only existed because I kept showing up long enough for there to be something worth documenting. The persistence came first. The protection followed. Kevin and I are still finding our way back to each other. It's slow. The ice holds a little better each time we test it. My father built things carefully and kept records of everything he made. I inherited that from him without realizing it. Turns out it was the most valuable thing he ever gave me, more than the $9,000, more than anything else. Your dad. Just those 2 words at the bottom of a letter. That was enough.